It's kind of a scar, not just a physical scar in a sense, but it's an emotional scar on this part of the state. The fact that the towns are not around, people are always wondering what it was like there. It's like a lost Atlantis. What was it like?
It was just a thriving community, the way everybody worked together and cared about each other, even though they weren't related.
But by the early 1890s, with that wave of immigration from mostly Europe, they needed a lot more water, not only for Boston, but many of the towns and cities around it.
They took that because of the water supply that was available. It was the easiest way for them to get it, them being the government.
Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott, the four towns were dissolved. So that's why we only have 351 towns in the state and cities and not 355.
It's become an accidental wilderness, but to all the people that once lived here, it was their lifeblood and their livelihoods.
It's a beautiful place today, and it was a beautiful place then.
People will say all we had was our land and our community, and both are gone forever.
They could have done any number of things without hurting all the people to have to give up everything they'd ever worked for.
Part of my mission is to keep the story fresh. Probably nothing is more discouraging to me. And those folks have no idea where their water came from, and particularly what was sacrificed.
There's just beautiful, rich history around here. I think it's something to be remembered.
Loss is something that perpetuates itself over generations, and in some ways even gets strengthened over generations. And when your home is underwater, there's no going back.
The name Quabbin was an Indian name, which meant many waters. My name is Elizabeth Pierce. Most everybody calls me Zib. It's a name that my younger brother gave me when he couldn't handle 3 syllables at once. And it's stuck with me all my life. I was born in Orange, and I've lived here most of my life. My husband's name was Clifton Pierce, and that was spelled with a P-E-I, and I always say no pie in this Pierce. I would never have met him had it not been for the Quabbin Project. He was born in Prescott, and if he hadn't had to leave Prescott, I probably would have never met him. Before that, I mean, they had the store in the valley where everybody gathered.
What did they sell?
Everything from rubber boots to kerosene. They sold everything.
Most people lived comfortable existences. What you hear a lot from people's histories is they say, we didn't know we were poor. We were farmers, we had land, we owned our home, we had a community, we had enough to eat.
A lot of them were farmers. Some of them worked in some of the factories and mills in the valley. A few of them were storekeepers. They generally were what you would call WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, descendants of many of the original settlers who came in the 1730s and 40s and 50s.
The community was extremely close. Everybody knew their history, everybody knew who they were related to, and they were content.
Why did they take the 4 towns?
Boston never had enough water and did not have good water. Jamaica Pond was one of the first water sources, and the city grew and the surrounding areas grew so quickly that they could never keep up.
By the early 1890s, with all the that wave of immigration that was coming in from mostly Europe, they needed a lot more water, not only for Boston, but many of the towns and cities around it.
So the city of Boston, starting in the 19th century, built a series of drinking water reservoirs, moving further and further west into the state.
And then by 1895, they had to build the Wachusett Reservoir, which they hoped would be sufficient. But as they were building it, they already knew that there was not going to be enough water.
In 1926, legislators passed the Ware River Act to take land in the Ware River and also to be able to build this big aqueduct. And then in 1927 was the Swift River Act that created the process to build the reservoir, to take the land and construct the reservoir.
They had a farewell ball in the town of Enfield to not celebrate, but sort of, note the passing of their towns, because legislation dictated that on 12:01 a.m., April 28, 1938, the 4 towns were officially disincorporated.
There were 4 entire towns that were removed: Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott. There were also 7 towns that surround the reservoir today that all lost pieces to the project.
All the buildings were taken down. All the trees were taken down. The farmland was stripped. All the plants were removed. Everything was set on fire, and then it was flooded. It looks like a moonscape. There is nothing organic left.
And then when the clearing and construction were done in 1939, that's when the reservoir started to fill.
But they built 2 large, basically earthen dams at the southern end of the Swift River Valley to flood all this back. One's called a dam because it has a spillway. The other one's called a dike because it does not.
The dam and the dike caused the Swift River to flood the valley, and that was a very long, slow process. It wasn't full until 1946. They chose this spot because it's the topography of it and the elevation of it. So the water ends up in Boston, it's all gravity, there's no pumping. So it starts here at Quabbin. They built in the 1920s and 30s a very large aqueduct, a huge tunnel underground. There's a series of covered reservoirs, big concrete tanks that are buried underground. So the treated water is held there, and then it flows to the towns, to people's homes.
It intended to flood the valley and to create a reservoir of 412 billion gallon capacity. It did serve its purpose and has served it very well from the engineering and water supply standpoint.
There is this incredibly abundant water source, and then the people who are part of that diaspora, the towns surrounding the Quabbin do not, for the most part, drink its water. They have their own that they use.
A lot of times people will come in really disturbed by the fact that the government, used eminent domain to take people's property and to build a reservoir. They were paid if they owned property, and sometimes they got loss of business. But a lot of people didn't get anything, they just had to move.
I believe that Ulysses, my great-grandfather, got $100 an acre, $17,000, but he had to give $8,000 to his lawyers in 1936 for fighting the takeover to try to keep his land.
Those were not the days of protests. A couple million people in Metro Boston, and there were 2,500 people who lived in this area. So they could see, it was very futile. These people were pretty much resigned to their fate.
So a lot of people, it doesn't seem like a lot, but it did actually have a big ripple effect because there's a lot of people in this area who will still hold some resentment towards the state for the project.
The younger people saw it as an opportunity. The older people were heartbroken and just torn apart.
I'm still homesick. And that's real, that's something real too. And there were many people that just never got over. There's a sort of a trauma, to this kind of a thing, to being forced.
I've got no home to go back to. You see, I'm without a birthplace, as you might say. You can't go back and see where I was born.
A lot of the old-timers died of broken hearts because they had to give up a home.
It didn't dawn on me what was happening until they began to knock buildings down.
I can't go back. It makes me physically sick.
My name is Tina Meyer, and I wrote this poem after visiting the ruins of cellar holes and roads and just the remains of a life lived and now gone. After the taking, I heard your whispers from under the ferns, your mother's crying amidst the dead red pine, a child laughing at the water's edge, splashes in the brook. I heard your pots and pans and roosters, a school bell and hammers on stone. I heard oxen bellow, gunshots and voices saying, "We won't go." I smelled milk paint, chicken stew and apple pie, and horses. From the dirt came smells of sweat and blood, new corn, the putrid dust of flesh and bone. Do you remember the sense of the spring lilacs and your lily of the Swift River Valley, lost to the world forever? I walked through your wagon ruts and hayfields, through your gardens and privies. I touched the leaves of the trees growing up from your graves. I walked through the places of your life, the rooms of your hearts. And I saw the stones, the school steps, the millstone, the lovingly laid cellars, and the walls that, in the end, couldn't keep out the big, big water.
Diving is like a ticket to a different world. You can move freely in 3 dimensions. Often you dive on coral, you dive with fish, you might see a shipwreck, but this was a different kind of diving. This was a diving where you got a window into the past.
We were restricted to dive with the State Police dive team, which was fine with me because I knew the head of the dive team, Blake Gilmore. In fact, he trained me. So he said, we'll just extend the training. Rather than looking for bodies, we'll look for the remains of the old towns.
Now, a team of professionals consisting of researchers from nearby University of Massachusetts, members of the Massachusetts State Police dive team, and Metropolitan District Commission rangers have joined together to explore the waters of Quabbin Reservoir.
Divers enjoy the unknown of what you're going to find. You're dropping through a water column, what's at the bottom? As you can see in the old under Quabbin, on most dives, if you took a dive into the Quabbin, it's like dropping into a desert. You see some tree stumps. If you're lucky, you get a stone wall. It's pretty empty. On one of the shallow dives, we discovered a cemetery of Enfield.
I still vividly remember the gateposts that were around the cemetery, and you could imagine that this was a place where people might have gone to put flowers on an ancestor's grave. And we did find gravestones that were still there. This was something that was really special because this was the Quabbin. It's so much a part of Massachusetts history, of life, of the water supply of Boston. People lived there. People walked on that land that we were floating over. I do work on diasporas of people who have left a home country. I find it so interesting that I did do the diving on a place that people had moved away from, and that then I didn't realize the significance of it at the time. And part of the idea of a diaspora is you can't go home. You keep wanting to go home, but you can't. And when your home is underwater, there's no going back. You could brush the dust off of those gravestones and see that memories were still there.
There's gravestones from amongst the 34 cemeteries for the Reservoir Project. A lot of those graves, about 80% of them came to Quabbin Park Cemetery. Some of them, the family had a choice that they could have them moved to other cemeteries of their choice. And in the documentary, you'll see that there's gravestones that are still there underwater, and that really caused a rife because, being told that everyone was taken care of, then to find out that there's still gravestones underwater that they weren't, really upset a lot of people. So neither the Swift River Valley Historical Society or the Friends of Quabbin would carry the DVD and resell it. I'm Gene H. Thoreau. Southwick, Massachusetts. I'm the president of the board of directors of the Friends of Quabbin, a group concerned with conservation and preservation of the Quabbin story. Father and my mother, they're direct descendants of former residents of the Swift River Valley, and I've done an extensive amount of research on my ancestry. I've spent thousands of hours in this very hollow grounds of Quabbin Park Cemetery. We're going to the oldest section of the cemetery, section 20, which is on the far right. And most of these residents are from the former town of Greenwich. And there's some Enfield folks over here. And a lot of my Greenwich ancestors are over here. There's at least 12 of my relatives and ancestors over here. So this is a very special spot for me. And I spent a lot of time out here. This is one of my grandfathers right here from the Gibbs family. We work our way down here. So 2 Drinkwater daughters. They were both educators.
Is there any significance with their last name and the fact that the Quabbin is about drinking water?
No, that's just a coincidence. This is the grave site of my 3rd great-grandfather, Ira Jones. This gravestone was originally in Enfield. We owe it to these former residents that are interred here to ensure that the history is preserved, that nobody forgets what was sacrificed to provide that clean, sustainable water to the city of Boston and other communities.
The more I knew about what went on there, the more I wanted to share it. And that was what led me to write the 3 books. I did 1 book and then I thought, there's still more to tell. I have no connection with the Quabbin, only through my husband. When he was displaced, he would have been 18. His family moved to Orange, and we met in high school. He was the president of the Historical Society. I went along with the package deal. I sort of became immersed in Quabbin and Quabbin stories through him. I was fascinated by the way they were able to readapt their lives and move on, but still carry their memories. And I became a curator historian of the Historical Society.
Welcome to the Swift River Historical Society. My name is John Swan, and I'm a docent here at the Swift River Historical Society. A docent is a person that knows a lot about the subject but doesn't have a degree in it. I've always lived in New Salem, and my father was involved, and my mom was from Dana, and her family lived there for 194 years. The house was a big house, and a lot of people in the family lived there from 1743 to 1938. My mother was the 7th generation to live in the Quabbin, and I would have been the 8th generation. So I was the first generation out in my family from the Quabbin.
How does that feel?
It feels like I lost my heritage. The building that we're in right now is called the Whitaker Cleary House, and it was built in 1816. It was doomed to be torn down because of the watershed taking this property. My father happened to be the selectman at the time, and he was able to save it for all their artifacts. When they purchased this building, I was only 10 years old, and I came in and I could remember this wallpaper from back then. And I thought, my God, what kind of wallpaper is this? And I've never seen anything like it. This is the original wallpaper from then, and this was a very beautiful building. This is called the map room, and it's not right exactly to scale, but this was before they flooded the Quabbin Reservoir, where everybody lived and where all the little houses were. My family came into this area down on Skinner Hill.
Working here now, do you feel closer to your family history?
Yeah, I do, and I feel like I'm speaking for them, in a way.
My husband loved talking to the visitors that came to the museum. He was responsible for the building of the carriage shed.
This was taken from different schools in the district.
There's one section in it that's a replica of a one-room school. The rest of the carriage shed has farm equipment.
But the highlight of the shed is a diorama of the valley.
I'm working on a diorama that has the 4 lost towns that used to be in the Quabbin. It's an amazing story. All these towns were self-sufficient, so I just loved the whole thought of creating the towns in memory of the Quabbin Valley as it was 100 years ago. It's taken me about 2 years, and it progresses through the seasons. And the railroad that used to run through the valley, called the Rabbit Run, it was the Boston and Albany line, Athol branch. It was the lifeblood of the Swift River Valley. So it transported people and animals and ice and produce, and it ran twice a day up and down the valley. The Rabbit Run Railroad started in about 1870, and it was called the Rabbit Run actually because with all these roughly 9 different stations or stops, it never got going very fast, and it was hopping from one stop to the next. So the whole railroad was about 50 miles, and it ran for about 50 years. So yeah, it was quite a significant transportation method for the valley. And then in the 1930s, they were phased out. The tracks were all torn up, and then they built the Quabbin Reservoir.
The thing that got me the most was when that damned wrecker come along down picking up the rails on the railroad track. That hit right to home. That was the end of our railroad and the end of our village. Some of these things.
Does it hurt to remember it?
It does me. It gets me.
Do you feel bitter?
Well, I don't feel like I was eating honey.
The question of creation of dams and reservoirs is always a contentious issue because typically it is rural people who are moved out of an area for the benefit of a larger city. It's a question of what level do you view your community on? You know, are you part of the Swift River Valley? Are you part of Massachusetts? Are you part of your local community? Are you part of a larger community?
I think there's an emotional sky. Now, granted, most of those people are gone now, but a lot of their children and grandchildren are still alive, and they very much feel what they were told by their grandparents and parents. A very strong nostalgia. The old Thomas Wolfe phrase, you can't go home again. You know, where they grew up was under 80 or 90 feet of water or whatever, and they couldn't bring their grandchildren or somebody to see it.
There's many different gradations of us versus them. There's Boston versus the Valley, the engineers versus the townspeople. There is the commission with its grand ideas versus the people who are on the job. It was difficult for everyone. I think that maybe the histories minimize the amount of difficulty.
What I discovered was this huge divide between the people who were descendants of people who lived in the valley and the people who drink that water without knowing where it comes from. But those two things didn't happen in isolation. There had to be a connector. And it's the very human story of the engineers who came in as young men, largely. A lot of them were recent college graduates, and they were excited and idealistic to do this grand public works project that had never been done before. This is a cliche, but just like both the tragedy and the triumph of this project, the tragedy of the individuals who lived there and the triumph of this experimental engineering work that was immensely successful.
To me, it seems like there could have been a better way, and that's the way Ulysses and my grandfathers would have felt, I'm sure. But, you know, if they could only take the salt out of the salt water, we'd have plenty. But it's a necessary thing for survival, fresh, clean water, and that's what we all live on. And so horrible things like this has to happen, apparently.
In my opinion, it's always important to recognize that, yeah, this is really hard for the people that lived in these towns. I don't know what another solution could have been, and I think it's really important that we talk about the history and talk about what was there. But on the other hand, this is the drinking water supply for over 40% of Massachusetts. It is a very secure water supply for a lot of people. We manage over 80,000 acres of land and water. Because we are an unfiltered water supply, we have to limit the types of recreation we allow. So it's mainly hiking and some fishing during our fishing season.
When you walk in the trails, there are stone fences.
There are numbers of cellar holes. Dana Common, which can be reached off Gate 40 on the east side of the reservoir, they actually have pictures now of some of the buildings up on posts. You can see the town commons and the cellar holes all around it.
It adds just another dimension knowing that it was something else. The idea that those little hilltops rising out of the water are mountains. I really think that people need to go visit in order to understand, especially if you are somebody who benefits from Quabbin water. And I think that everybody should know where their water comes from.
It is a really beautiful area to explore, and also has become a great habitat for all kinds of wildlife we might not have in Massachusetts if this wasn't here.
I think it's always good to feel a sense of history in the place that we live. These sandwiches here, we have the Prescott, Greenwich, Enfield, Dana, all are named after towns that are no longer with us, but we still treasure them in our hearts.
A lot of our regulars have brought in things from like the old picture postcards to marketing materials, and so we use that as decor. And then in the naming of our beers, we also use a lot of the Quabbin references and a lot of the local town references. We wanted to make sure that as we built a community-based brewery, that it was rooted in the history of this area.
When Hampshire College was being formed, one of our founding trustees recognized how important it was for a newly formed college to have a sense of history. And so when they built the new residential areas on campus, they named them for the 4 towns. And it's nice even today to know that you can walk around campus and see those spaces and know that there were those towns.
This is a big deal that happened, and I think it's something to be remembered.
I didn't start out extending I was going to be a Quabbin historian. And the author of 16 books relating to the Quabbin Reservoir, but I can think of a lot worse paths to have gone on.
Do I think the Quabbin should have been built? Yes, I do. And probably there are a lot of people who disagree with me. But Boston would not be the city that it is today without the Quabbin. I grieve for the people who suffered so much, but this was the benefit of the many versus the few.
I hope there will always be people who will be interested. I think that it's important that people know that it's there and know that the government did this. And people will say to me, they couldn't do that today, could they? And I think that question is always there.